joining us today. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Um, that's us recording now, guys. So welcome everyone. And thank you so much for being with us at our webinar today. The webinar on ending violence against women and girls, taking learning and good practice from Europe. Comes as we've just kicked off the UN 16 Days of Action to end violence against women and girls. So it is pertinent and timely. It also comes as the EU has introduced its new directive on violence against women and girls, which since the UK has left, the EU won't apply in NI so far as we are currently aware, although with our Windsor framework protections, we should definitely make sure that that's the case. But it will apply in Ireland, and I think that's something that is incredibly important to think about and think about the consequences of potentially being able to stand on one side of the border and be more kind of protected and more safe than on the other side. This webinar also falls nicely in line with the continuing progress of the NI Executive Office to introduce its Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy. So today we're going to hear from the WAVE network on how the directive can change policy, and from Women's Aid Federation NI on what priorities for the new strategy are. So thank you both to Eliana and Sonya for being here with us today. There'll also be a discussion on what we can learn from the processes that led to these new frameworks today as well. So without further ado, I think I'll introduce our two speakers and then I will pass over. Eliana Jimeno is a senior advocacy advisor for Women Against Violence Europe, or WAVE, as is much easier to say. Eliana is a feminist leader in peace building, human rights, and advocacy with over 16 years' experience across local and international contexts. Originally from Colombia, she's worked in the USA and various European countries, bringing a unique perspective to her work. Her expertise bridges public policy, partnership building, and innovative program design, combining empathy-driven community building with strategic mindset. Her intersectional and action-oriented approach positions her as a dynamic advocate for transformative change. She centers celebration, solidarity, and laughter as everyday forms of resistance to disrupt oppressive structures. So thank you so much for being with us today, Eliana. And our second speaker this evening will be Sonya McMullan, the Regional Services Manager for Women's Aid Federation. She's worked for Women's Aid Federation in various roles since 1999. Sonya has a background in law and a keen interest in issues in relation to domestic and sexual abuse, and has completed several pieces of research in this area. More recently, she's worked closely on the new domestic abuse offence and subsequent new legislation in areas of domestic and sexual abuse on a policy level. Sonya sits on the European Women's Lobby Observatory as the UK representative and is the NI delegate for WAVE. She's also on the board of Rosario Football Club and is their safeguarding lead. She's contributed to various books, including Sexual Violence on Trial, Local and Comparative Perspectives, and Criminalising Coercive Control, Challenges for the Implementation of Northern Ireland's Domestic Abuse Offence. She also has the illustrious title of being my former boss, and I haven't seen her in a beat, so it's really great that you're here. Thank you so much. Okay, with that then, I think we'll pass over to Eliana, and we're really excited to hear about your presentation. Thank you.
Hello to everyone, and thank you so much for giving me and the WAVE network the opportunity to be part of this discussion and to share what has been the experience and the work that WAVE has done in terms of advocacy around the European Directive on Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. And also, I will present very briefly what the context was, politically speaking, that led to this directive. What are the current steps after it has been approved in May this year? And then what are the challenges that we are facing at the European level? And then touching very briefly on the implications for EU countries, also countries that are in the path to accession to the EU, and also the specific potential impact in Northern Ireland. And with that, let me just share my screen and let me see. Okay, there you go. Great. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. I hope that other small one goes away. Yes. All right. So What I'm gonna also is to introduce other aspects regarding legislation that has been adopted also next to the directive, and to analyze that context from this perspective. Um, Emma, if you can help me with a reminder in terms of the time that I have allocated so I don't go over it.
Yeah, no problem at all. I can do that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Good. So, as I have shared beforehand, this is the agenda of what I'm going to share with you, the context and the legislative frameworks in the EU, what happened with the European Directive on Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, what are the challenges and opportunities that we have ahead, and some conclusions um, based on this. So, in terms of the current context and the legislative framework, um, what we have is that this directive was discussed, presented, and adopted during the previous legislative term of the European Parliament. So that was a term from 2019 to 2024, which, even though at the time we thought that maybe we could achieve more, now in hindsight, we can see that actually the parliament members that we have, the MEPs, were quite progressive. I'm specifically having in mind those who are or were members of the FEM committee, but overall, in terms of the political balance, in terms of the political groups present in the European Parliament, we had much more of a center left type of parliament, which is totally not the case with the new European Parliament. So, what we had at the time was a very progressive approach in terms of achieving legislation and policy when it comes to gender equality within the EU. There was also a key institutional aspect, and that was the fact that we had a specific commissioner that was solely dedicated to equality. So this is equality in all aspects of EU policy and strategies, and it was the first time that we had such a commissioner because the previous term, this portfolio was merged, and now in this new commission, which was just confirmed yesterday, we have again a merged portfolio. So the condition of this period that we just finished was very, very special in that regard because we had not only the commissioner, but a full team behind her who had enough time to dedicate to strategy and policy development. Then we also had the gender equality strategy 2020, 2025, that was also building on this momentum that had been reached up until then, that this was clearly a priority in terms of addressing gender-based violence, to be able to develop uh, a specific legislation that can move forward and push member states to take decisions and adopt a specific protections in different areas. So what we had is the main point of this discussion today, which is the adoption of the Directive on Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, which was adopted in May, as I shared beforehand. Then we also achieved the EU accession to the Istanbul Convention to a limited extent because of the legal basis and the legal framework within the EU. There are certain elements that are not within the competency of the EU, and those are the ones that the EU did not accede into. So this has to do with asylum and non-refoulement, but in all other aspects, it acceded to. So that was a major step forward. And on top of that, we also had the approval of the Care Directive, the Pay Transparency Directive, the Women on Boards Directive, the Work-Life Balance Directive that are specifically targeting women as well as gender equality. But also we had a more transversal approach in all conversations that we're wondering and discussing, okay, how can we integrate a gender lens into policy and strategy? Then we also had two additional pieces of legislation that were initiated, but it was not possible to finish them. One is the recommendation on harmful practices, and the other one is the revision of the Victims' Rights Directive. And the VRD, it's key because in the proposal for revision that the European Commission put forward, they are also including the specific need for protection and support of victims of domestic violence and intimate partner violence and gender-based violence. Uh, Now we are not sure that that's going to stay in the text because Now that is going to be negotiated with this current parliament, which, as you will see soon when I explain more, it has a very different approach. So now going more into detail on the European Directive on Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. The scope of the directive was very much determined by the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. What they tried to do was to have an ample interpretation of Article 83 of the TFAU, and that one is specifically on sexual exploitation. So, in this broad interpretation of this article, then the Commission put forward a proposal that included that tech facilitated crimes as well as rape, femicide, sexual harassment, different forms of domestic violence, forced sterilization, forced abortion, and all different forms of cyber violence could fold into uh, that broader understanding of sexual exploitation. So these aspects, the consistency that that Commission was trying to achieve was to cover all of these aspects. However, this is not what was finally in the text. This is what the scope of the original proposal was, trying to identify and to understand sexual exploitation as something that is manifested through these different crimes. All directives is also important to remark that these are minimum rules on specific sanctions that might be established. So this is very much criminal law, and in that regard, the focus of the directive, because of the legal basis, it's on crimes, and it's not necessarily on prevention or protection or access to justice or the extended support that survivors for gender-based violence need, because that was not necessarily what the legal basis allowed for. Nonetheless, the European Commission in its proposal tried to emulate the four-piece approach of the Istanbul Convention, and they did include articles and chapters for each one of these pieces. So there were elements in terms of prevention of gender-based violence, so primary and secondary and tertiary prevention, education, sexual health and reproductive rights, campaigns, trainings in protection, a stronger victim support, including specifically women specialist support services, access to justice, then prosecution of perpetrators and the different aggravating circumstances of the different crimes, and then a stronger aspect in terms of coordination of member states and the participation of civil society and women's organizations as co-implementers. So this was the initial scope. This was the initial intention, but not all of this was what was finally approved. And here is the actual result of what we have. So the size of the graphic, or the size of these parts, represent the weight that they have basically into the directive. So what we see is that half of the directive is very much focused on only tech facilitated gender-based violence. So it's very much, we have six crimes that had to do with cyber violence. And in addition to that, FGM. All other crimes that I had mentioned beforehand, they were not finally in the text. They were not approved. There was a lot of discussion. And mostly the member states did not accept that broader interpretation of sexual exploitation could actually cover the criminalization of rape, femicide, forced sterilization, and some other aspects. So it's very much a criminal law type of directive. And then there are some elements in terms of protection and access to justice that had to do with reporting, the assessments, the referral to different services. In terms of victim support, it has very much the same focus that the previous version of the Victims' Rights Directive has, meaning that in terms of the structure, it's not putting general support services at the same level as women specialist services, but women specialist services are subsidiary to general services. So women will have to go first to general services, and they will have the prerogative to referring, if considered necessary, to women specialist services. Of course, survivors can go if they want to directly, but in terms of the hierarchy and how the directive establishes it, it's the same as in the previous VRD. Then there are a lot of provisions that had to do with intersectional discrimination in the general part and aspects in terms of prevention. There are training campaigns, education, but very general, very much. This directive is also very much geared to member states and not necessarily covering the main gaps. So we can see in terms of training that, for example, we were pushing in our advocacy for training of the judiciary, and they rejected it because they mentioned that that is an invasion of their um, independence. And the same goes for coordination, that you can see that this square is quite small. It's basically because there is very little in this directive in terms of coordination. So that is the current like picture of how the directive is. As I shared, we had it was adopted in May of this year, and the member states will have 3 years for transposition, meaning to introduce it into their national legislation. The European Commission is going to start developing different workshops next year to guide the implementation. We have also been doing advocacy to ensure that there is presence of civil society, but some member states are not so happy to have us there. So that's still part of our advocacy. Challenges, what I had mentioned already, this very strong focus on criminalization, that is not having the four-piece approach that is more balanced as the Istanbul Convention. It doesn't include the definition of rape based on the absence of consent. It also does not include sexual assault. It doesn't include forced sterilization. The protection of migrant and refugee women is very bad. Basically, member states and including services, depending on how this directive is transposed, will have to report to migration authorities when survivors access services. And the same goes for first respondents in the case of health services and also when seeking access to justice. Uh, Women specialized services are not mentioned in the articles, but only in the recitals. And this holistic approach that we had also pushed forward, and we did a lot of advocacy in terms of including primary prevention. It's in the recitals, so it's not really included in the articles, which is not good at all, because then it's very much open to the member states to achieve the result of the directive according to the articles, and then the recitals are more like the recommendations. And then in terms of intersectionality, because it's also only the recitals, then in the end, this is kind of performative. It's there, but not really in the content. Um, yeah. So going more into detail into this specific aspect of what is not included and what is missing in terms of intersectionality, this lack of protection of migrant women that I had mentioned, there is no specific mentioning of the impact of gender-based violence against LGBTI people and what are the specific vulnerabilities and fragilities that they have. And the specific need for support, which was demanded, but that's not included. Then this aspect of data transferring, which is this very much securitized approach that some member states continue to have. Uh, we also did a lot of advocacy in terms of including the interconnection and between domestic violence and violence against children, and also the implications for child custody cases. But that was excluded because family law does not fall under the provisions of what member states and the EU can actually legislate. So that's not there. But that also means that there is no recognition of this continuum of violence. This also happens when it comes to the understanding of uh, online violence and offline violence. It's kind of like as if online was a completely parallel world and not really connected to the violence that is also happening offline. The points that I had mentioned already in terms of the lack of the inclusion of rape, sexual assault, there was a lot of discussion also in terms of the potential age that could be included for consent. That was highly debated, sorry, by the member states, and that's also part of why they didn't reach any kind of agreement there. Then intersex mutilation, forced sterilization, forced marriage, sexual harassment in the workplace. Uh, they were considered not to be part of the legal basis. In the end, we were able to push some aspects in terms of harassment in the workplace, but not necessarily sexual harassment. So not as specific as it was pushed by the unions. And there are certain elements in terms of the aggravating circumstances of the crimes that are included, like the residence status of the victim, that the victim might be intoxicated, that it can whether or not they can record the offense. And this is a huge debate because there are a lot of apps and requests from women-led organizations that the data that is collected in such apps by survivors and victims can actually be used as evidence, and that was not included. So we're just like missing opportunities there. And then in terms of the article, the possibility of being able to report crimes without being fearful, this will have implications in your status in the country, the access to support services, what I had mentioned beforehand, that are depending on general services, and also informing victims that the perpetrators have left jail is something that we had asked for and is not included. So basically, in terms of just even prevention and informing the family that this could happen, it was not included. The point of training just judges that, as I mentioned beforehand, it was considered a violation of their judicial independence, so it's out. The custody of children, the possibility at least to have some protection, because there were elements and articles in the directive that have to do with the protection of children. But in the case of visitation rights, they didn't touch it. Again, going back to that's family law and we don't want to touch it, so they didn't. We also asked for direct compensation for victims, and member states said that's way too expensive, so that was gone. And specifically, to have cases of gender-based violence, and this was very much pushed by the unions to have like a responsible in workplaces to deal with these cases from a gendered lens, and it's not the case. So it's more like you can suffer harassment, but it's not necessarily seen as a from a gender perspective. And women-led CSOs are not part of the picture when it comes to the implementation of the complementation of the directive. So the impact that it has is that it will not have immediate impact, of course. Sure, no problem. Thank you. That they will have these 3 years for transposition, and then at least there are two elements that are important. There is this non-regression clause. So for member states that had a more advanced legislation, they cannot change it and lower the standards to meet the standards of the directive. They need to stay at the level that they had already. And also, there is the possibility of reviewing the directive in 5 years, but that means 5 years after the transposition. So, effectively, 8 years after it was approved. And at least there is the possibility that we will have more clarity in terms of which are the agencies that should be responsible for the implementation of the directive. And this is very much linked to the Istanbul Convention, because they will have to report since the EU acceded and they need to collect all the information at the EU level. Some agencies will be responsible for that, and that will depend on what nationally is being implemented. So in terms of the impact of this on EU countries in the process to accession, of course, they will need to, part of their requisites is that they need to harmonize legislation before they enter or try to do it as much as possible. So this will bring the possibility to integrate these elements into national legislation. Also, it reinforces the Istanbul Convention. They really will go hand in hand in terms of the implementation, and it will allow for further capacity building in the whole process that the Commission offers in terms of support to these states that are looking forward to being included into the EU. In terms of Northern Ireland, what you had mentioned beforehand, Emma, that the possibility that the Windsor framework could be used to integrate the directive. The issue is that that framework is specifically for goods and customs and not necessarily for criminal law and social policy. I don't know to what extent there is a possibility to expand that, but that's a big question. But it doesn't really automatically enter into force or will have direct impact in Northern Ireland. I think, again, as with the previous option with the states that will exit to the EU, it will reinforce the conversation and the importance of the Istanbul Convention and the possibility to advocate for that. Like, okay, at least we should have to be able to offer consistent access to services and justice for survivors, at least to continue to advocate more for the Istanbul Convention. And that is something that can be also done at the with the UK to be able to move this forward. Then the point that you were mentioning as well in terms of cross-border cooperation, that will be key to be able to harmonize policies because otherwise, really, as you said, it will be like across like as soon as you cross the border, then you have a completely different level of protection, and then a huge possibility for advocacy and civil society influence that I will touch more in detail at the end. But basically, there is a lot of space for advocacy, depending, of course, on how many allies you have at the national level. The current context, very briefly, what I was saying beforehand is that we don't have anymore a center left parliament. We have a center right parliament. We don't have uh, a commissioner that is dedicated to equality anymore. This portfolio is now merged with preparedness and crisis management. And because of the current context and discussions about war, we fear that this portfolio will be pushed to the side and not really centered in the conversations. We have seen an oversimplification of the gender equality agenda, having discussions about how maybe the next legislation should be about how women can be healthier by doing better diets and, exercising more. So that's the level of discussions that I'm hearing and other even more horrible discussions in the European Parliament. And that is really echoing less progressive member states that are pushing for a regressive type of approach. And they basically keep on telling us, look, you have achieved enough, and now it's time for you to shut up, like literally at that level. In terms of the other policy frameworks, what is coming and maybe will also have an impact in Northern Ireland will be a new gender equality strategy that is going to be issued from 2025, 2030. Some elements there, also a roadmap for women's rights. And I think a big conversation that I did not include here, but its key is also Beijing plus 30. That's been an overall global conversation, and some elements can be used to, like pull a little bit the discussion in terms of the six priorities that had been identified in Beijing plus 30 that can go into the specific discussion of gender-based violence and to be able to push forward for again a stronger implementation of this type of legislation, the Istanbul Convention, and to look into the similarities between these three. So the roadmap, the gender equality strategy, and the elements in the Istanbul Convention. And then to close, I think there are four specific aspects in terms of advocacy that can be done uh, in Northern Ireland. So the first one is the point that I had mentioned beforehand, is to push for the full ratification and implementation of the Istanbul Convention, to highlight the need and the importance to have that level, because in theory, the directive is a copy of the Istanbul Convention. So that will allow for this cross-border cooperation uh, to ensure also that there is a specific legislation to be able to access support services and that there is this cross-border cooperation and the harmonized approach when it comes to what victims can be able to access to increase funding for women specialist services. I think that's a common goal and we can all push for that. And also to strategize more locally and on the potential negative impacts that not having a harmonized approach could have on the lives of women and survivors. And that's it from me. Thank you so much. And sorry for the hurry, but yeah, I'm really happy to answer any questions later on.
Thank you so much, Eliana. I think that was incredibly interesting. It's really useful to be able to hear about those EU processes and just what an impact the political kind of landscape can have on those directives coming out of the EU. I think we're going to save all of our questions to the end, folks, if that's okay. So, um, now we're going to move on to Sonia's presentation, if that's okay. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know what I'm saying or what you're saying. So is that let me see.
We can see your presentation, Sonya. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. That was so interesting and so topical looking at the cross-border cooperation on God, when was it? Was it Monday or Tuesday? I can't even remember. We launched this document with the National Women's Council, and it was looking, North-South cooperation to tackle violence against women, and it was a dialogue report. And we've been working for the last while, coming together with other frontline agencies in the South and the North, joining, looking refuge workers from the North, refuge workers from the South, that kind of thing, sharing good practice and what that looks like. But also the impacts of Brexit and also especially the impacts on our local women's aid groups that would work across the border. You have a protection order in the north, you step across, you're not protected. All of those issues that are coming up. Your children are going for contact, north of the border. You live in Donegal, they're going to Derry. It's all of those things. And the legislation and everything is so different. It really is sitting very differently. But we got it was a very small amount of money from the Shared Ireland Fund. So hopefully following on from the report, we can get a little bit more funding to continue that dialogue because we really need to do that. And so I'll send you a link actually to that report as well, Yona, and you can share it with everyone if anyone is interested. So I always put this up. I know it just, really, really important. It's difficult and it's been a difficult week. And hopefully, our few weeks within the work that we do, especially for anyone, working in this part of the country, the media reports and everything have been really challenging and difficult. And, um, you know, yeah. So, and hopefully none of this will be too triggering, but there are a few things. So just about looking after yourself. So for anybody who doesn't know, Women's Aid Federation, we're a voluntary organisation. Obviously, we're a membership organisation and we've 8 local women's aid groups across Northern Ireland who are providing that frontline support for women, children and young people. And that's where they all are. And Karen, here are your wonderful statistics. And Karen, or Emma, your previous wonderful statistics that you used to present. That was fun times, wasn't it? Trying to get the annual report together. But, we produced our annual statistics. They launched on Monday as part of the 16 days of action. And, we've 527 women there staying in refuge, 291 children have gone down over the last couple of years, but due to the lack of housing stock, we have a lot of women and children who are actually stuck when they're ready to move on. And that's a real challenge we have as well in relation to housing here in this part of the world. There's been a review into routine inquiry through maternity, midwifery and health visiting. And you can see there, on average, usually a baby once a month would be born in refuge. I was in refuge on Monday and it was 2 6-month-old babies. Both had been there. One had been there from 3 weeks and one had been there from 6 weeks. That's all they know, is the refuge. And we know about the increase and escalation of domestic abuse, or indeed the start during pregnancy. So we welcome the review into routine inquiry because it's much needed. During that last year, there was almost 11,000 referrals to services across the country, and our refuges remain really steadily, full, high occupancy. And we have pretty good, compared to the south, that is something that we do have per head of population, very good rates of refuge, but we shouldn't have to have refuge. We should be going in. I remember at one of the WAVE meetings going to the intervention centre in Vienna and the model that they have with regard to the removal of the perpetrator, which we would have if we had a better, emergency barring orders, thinking of, Istanbul or Article 52 or whatever it is around that, it's so important. And let's hope, we get the domestic abuse protection orders and notices in place. But as you can see, setting the scene in context of domestic abuse here in Northern Ireland, it is really high. A fifth of all of our crime is domestic abuse. That is huge and staggering. And our police service does not get a fifth of all the money to deal with it, I can tell you that much. So, the statistic on the side, and this one here is very triggering, but, it's really, really important. We're in the 16 days of action. We should be talking about these issues every day of the week. This was Alison Morris's front page a couple of weeks ago, and we thank Alison for constantly keeping these women, these girls, these babies who have lost their lives at the hands of male violence. This was 42 women from 2017 that have lost their lives here in Northern Ireland, from 23 months to 83 years old, from every part of Northern Ireland. And, it's awful. It's really awful, but we all know about the high rate of femicide. We collate, or Karen collates with Women's Aid Ireland, the femicide record for this island, and we also contribute to the UK femicide report. Imagine having to keep a database of women who have died, and that's the reality of what we have to do. So look, I really want to take a minute during the 16 days as we are, and this is an event as part of that, in memory of all the women who've been murdered or have taken their own lives as well as a result of domestic abuse. They're not forgotten. And I suppose for ourselves and many of the organisations and people, on this call tonight, we will forever, make it our mission definitely to fight to make visible, the extent of men's fatal violence. So thank you very much for that. It's just important to take a minute. So how far have we come? I suppose whenever we're looking at the EU directive, and I'm jotting down notes about, many of you have, died around consultation. My God, the amount of work we had over the last number of years because, again, of our stop-start government. So the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act, that was our coercive control legislation. That was our domestic abuse offence, and we welcomed that. We wanted more in it. We wanted, housing like they had in the Domestic Abuse Bill in Westminster, and, secure tenancies, and also more, issues around migrant women, etc. But it was very much coercive control, domestic abuse offence, and the child aggravator, which we welcome for the first time. It did recognise children, didn't go as far as we wanted it to. There's also domestic abuse protection orders and notices, like that intervention model I was saying in Vienna, where you would go in and be able to remove the perpetrator for maybe up to 10 days. We don't know the logistics of it. It's a different order because the police would be going in to present this in the court, rather than the woman having to go herself to court. There would be no costs attached to that either. We know the debt, and the woman, Siobhan, you're on here, you know about the costs of going to court and all of that as well. And, we still have women coming out with 1,500, 2,000. They've been charged for protection orders, even though we have legal aid waivers in place. But we've just done a review into legal aid and to save civil legal aid. There was a consultation process in relation to that, as many of you know. And whenever we went around the country and spoke to women, there's a real lack of lawyers that are actually providing legal aid work. And that is becoming worse year on year, and good quality service as well, because you're getting legal aid. Are you getting the same as if you're a private client? So a lot of issues around that. I suppose it closed the gap and it brought us in line with the rest of the UK, which we welcomed. The sentencing, we hope to reflect the crime, and recognise that pattern of behaviour, putting the focus onto the perpetrator and recognising their behaviours. And hopefully that will, continue. And I think, we all need a lot more learning around coercive control and that pattern, and how to prosecute that. And it'll take a while to embed itself. Interestingly, the review from the Criminal Justice Inspection 2 years in, the key recommendations were mostly around children and young people, and that was the first time I've ever seen that in an inspection report. I suppose we really welcome the inspection because in absence of really good oversight and monitoring in relation to any of our strategies and legislation, etc., we don't have a commissioner, etc. We don't have committees like they do in Europe, and our safeguarding ministers or all those kind of things. So we do welcome that. The Justice Act then, that put everything but the kitchen sink in. I think, we had threats to publish images, cyber stalking, cyber flashing, the removal of the rough sex defence. Non-fatal strangulation was the big one in this that we had really campaigned and lobbied for. Within the first 48 hours, there was a charge. Within the first month, there was 100 charges, and there's an average of 70 charges a month at the moment. The police's stats are due out as we speak, the yearly bulletin. So it'll be really interesting to see what that looks like in relation to actual prosecutions for that offence. But imagine not having a piece of legislation for that, and we're looking at over 70 people a month being charged with that. So that was a real game changer in relation to legislation, but a really difficult subject matter to talk about for the focus groups that we had. And I welcome the women that came forward to talk to us about that because their voices were really heard. The Protection from Stalking Act again brought us into line with the rest of the UK, but we didn't have stalking protection orders and notices. We do have them, but there's only been 2 that have gone through. So that's an issue. Domestic homicide reviews, we welcome that, but isn't it a real shame that we are spending more money on a woman when she's dead than we did when she was alive through intervention models and early intervention and looking at all of those missed opportunities. We've campaigned strongly to get suicide included in the domestic homicide reviews, and there is a working group we hope getting started soon within the Department of Justice. So, and speaking to families who have been affected by this, we've talked to the Attorney General, we have a meeting with the coroner coming up. We have spoke to the mental health champion, about the mental health strategy, about our suicide strategy, about getting them better with regard to the inclusion of domestic abuse. Safe leave, the legislation that was a private member's bill by Rachel Woods, it's for consultation. The consultation was due in a few months ago, so we'll have to wait and see. Hopefully it'll be implemented, and that'll be 10 days safe leave and mandatory training for all employers across the country. So that will be remarkable when it comes in place. The Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, I'll not go into that in too much detail, but it's a multidisciplinary body where agencies, organisations, voluntary, statutory come together to highlight, protect and support high-risk victims. And there was a full review of that, and we welcome that, but it needs, again, investment. The Domestic Abuse Disclosure Scheme, very low disclosures coming through. The Clare's Law, which I'm sure you've all heard about, the right to ask and the power to tell. It could be used a lot better, but the threshold is lowered now in relation to coercive control. So we do hope that those numbers will increase, and we've done a piece of work with the police around that. Operation Encompass, where if there's a police call out in the middle of the night, there's children in the home, the designated child protection lead in the school will be contacted. So if Jimmy doesn't have his homework done, doesn't have his blazer, doesn't have his lunch, just wants a safe space to be, that's in place. So look, that's a lot of really good developments. We had a meeting with some colleagues in the south just a few hours ago, and really, they've got the new Kuhn Centre and a remarkable new gender-based strategy and everything going into their 3rd one. But 65 million euros being invested, over 50,000 euros going to direct frontline services. But they do have a lot more structural, pieces to start. So much work has gone in, Emma has introduced the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls in Northern Ireland. And I know or Tortured by Me, we're the only place we don't have recognition of, this. The UK couldn't believe it. Whenever we went to Westminster and spoke to some of the MPs, Jess Phillips, Stella Creasy, etc., who really helped. And Louise Haigh, actually, the Shadow Secretary of State at the time, she was brilliant at pushing this as well. So, the dialogue did change, thankfully, and at long last, we got a strategy. But we know that strategies alone, won't change anything. But there's 2 million. I talked about the 65 million euro in the south. We've got 3 million over 2 years. And it's not a drop in the ocean. It's not about money. Of course, it's not all about that, but really we need to invest now to save lives later, really. So both strategies, call for views came out for both of them at the same time, domestic and sexual violence strategy and the violence against women and girls strategy. The main pillars, similar to the Istanbul Convention, is what they were looking at: partnership, prevention, children and young people, support and provision, and justice. There was a 2-year co-design process. There's many people, around the call here today that were involved in that process. And there's now an Ending Violence Against Women and Girls what is it? It's office in the executive office in Stormont. And there's a number of people working there. So they've released this funding, and we don't really know what that'll be like. It's a 7-year strategy, like the domestic and sexual abuse strategy. And sorry, that is the domestic and sexual abuse strategy. So we're talking about the importance of children and young people and the voice of survivors. And this is really absolutely paramount. This is children's voices through our Social Action Youth Project, a wonderful project of young people who came together. They're all survivors of domestic abuse. They've been in refuge, they've been in outreach, their mums have been engaged in our service. And we've been working them for a couple of years now. And they've responded to consultations on RSE, on the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, domestic abuse strategy. And they have launched an animation and a website around healthy relationships, etc., and lots of other things, which will be going live next Tuesday. We have an event up in Stormont, and they are just amazing. But there was no children's pillar within the domestic and sexual abuse strategy, and we really pushed for that. And this is what the young people came up with that was really important for them. So we're really, really proud of them, and we're really proud to launch that next week. The Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategic framework, looking at the priorities then, to end violence against women and girls, they're looking at everything from sport to nighttime economy to street harassment to feeling safer, outdoors and then behind closed doors as well. And I suppose, for our government departments, the challenge was that they never looked at anything through a gendered lens in their life, especially within Department of Justice and Department of Health. If you said woman, you had to say man. And that's still the same, actually. So it's going to take them a wee while just to get their heads around it. Our definition of domestic abuse is very, very wide. And that is a challenge in itself as well. If you look at Scotland, the coercive control legislation is very modelled around an intimate partner. Violence definition as well. That skews our records in relation to the MARC, the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference too, because it's 2 brothers and 2 sisters, a father, a son, all of that kind of thing. And our data needs to get much better as well. The delivery plan then came out, and the strategy launched in September. And their focus, the main focus is going to be around prevention, but it's a 7-year roadmap to achieve the society-wide transformation needed to end violence against women and girls. And it will be supported by a series of delivery plans. So let's hope it goes better than our, child care strategy and our gender strategy and all our other things that we all spend so much time on, and they never actually go anywhere. And it's so disappointing. And I think that's the thing as well. With our government departments, they don't recognise the amount of money that goes into good quality consultation and response. And I think there needs to be an acknowledgement. I think we just all need to get paid for it, to be honest, you know. So this is what they're looking at with regard to their delivery plan. They're looking at prevention, so changing attitudes, behaviours, culture, the healthy, respectful relationships. Women and girls are safe and feel safe everywhere. Then the protection and provision, looking at the frontline services. There will be overlap with the domestic and sexual abuse strategy, but look, it's new and it's just embedding itself. The justice system then as well, of which we need to a lot more confidence in. I don't know if any of you or the Public Prosecution Service released their sexual offences bulletin this morning as well. So they said the days of was it 198 days or something around court cases coming, but I thought, no, that's definitely not right. I don't know where you've got your data from, but it's interesting to look at that improvement, or so they say. But again, attrition here in Northern Ireland in relation to both domestic abuse and sexual abuse is very, very worrying. And then looking at working better together, of course, as well, which we all need to do. None of us can do this in isolation, and there's plenty of room for everybody. But I suppose looking at the key priorities, you know, prevention is key for both the domestic and sexual abuse strategy and the ending violence against women and girls strategy. We all know the challenge we have with education and RSE. It has been a huge block in each and every one of us. You know, everybody's fighting this fight. The Gillen Review, you know, it was one of the key recommendations around training and education, and it just hasn't come to fruition, you know, at all. We're just going around and round in circles. You know, Human Rights Commission did a really good report. You know, we've all responded to consultations. Education Committee are doing their piece at the moment now, and we're all giving evidence and going up to speak to them, and so they'll come back. But like, it's just, you know, I've been nearly, you know, 30 years in this sector, and we're still having the same conversations. My God, stop wasting time. It's a human right for our children and young people to be able to talk about healthy relationships. And our young people from the Say Project are really, really clear about that too, because it needs to go further than that. You know, they're young people that were living with domestic abuse. They felt it was such a big secret. They couldn't talk to anybody in school or anybody else about this. And it's so important that if it was discussed as part of this framework, it would be really, really beneficial. Support for survivors. One of the issues that we have with both of the strategies is they talk about survivor engagement. It's a buzzword, you know, lived experience. We need the voice of survivors. And we ask them, well, how are you going to do that? And how are you going to do that in a meaningful and valuable way? They weren't really good, actually, what they came up with. You know, I remember one day whenever we were doing the one of the co-design sessions on the anti-violence against women and girls strategy, and one of the, you know, department officials had come up, and I wonder are any of them on the call, or any of you on the call? And then, you know, and they said, oh, do you think such and such is all right? And they were genuinely very worried about them. But I said, well, go and ask them, you know, you can talk, you know, it's this kind of that, you know, nearly afraid to talk. So what we have done, we've got a joint resource toolkit that we put together with Women's Aid, England, Scotland and Wales. And it's looking at how to engage meaningfully with survivors. And a guide to meaningful survivor engagement. I should know the name of it. So we had our first workshop with the Department of Justice and Department of Health, the officials that sit on the domestic and sexual abuse strategy last week, and it was really successful, and it was co-facilitated by two women from our survivor engagement group. So that was really, really important that they were in the room and they were heard and they were able to really have a voice. And they were very clear about that with regard to consultation responses, all of that. You know, they need to know where their words are going and how they're being used. It's the same in relation to media, for example. You know, we have the Responsible Reporting Matters, you remember, Emma? So we're refreshing that again, and going to do a number of workshops with journalists across the country as well to look at them and how they're reporting. One of the survivors in our group had done a recording for the police for a campaign. I think it was it might have been the 16 days. No, it was part of their action plan against violence against women and girls that the police launched. They're into year 2 of that now. And she agreed to do that at the time, but they used that material again, a number of months later without her consent. And she was really shocked. She's, heard in that on the TV, all over social media and everything. So it's really, really important. So we're hopefully doing a session with the police as well. We also have our research integrity framework in relation to researchers. And that was another joint resource done with England, Scotland, and Wales, because the amount of requests you get for research are huge as well. Strengthening the legal frameworks. We talked about the opportunity that they had to include secure housing within our domestic abuse legislation, and they didn't. We went to the Communities Committee and they asked us, why are you here and what does domestic abuse have to do with housing? So there's a lot of education needed around that piece as well. We need to really push on the domestic abuse protection orders and notices, because for people to have free protection orders, and we need to push on the legal aid waiver as well. We're really worried around the review to legal aid. There was meant to be announcements by the minister last week, but that didn't happen. And we're really worried that they're going to push back and legal aid will be reduced more. We need to keep that in that space and people need it. So it is really, really worrying. We need, good quality monitor and scrutinisation of all of our legislation. It's great going, oh yeah, look at this, all of these pieces of legislation that I showed you, but who is monitoring it? Who is overseeing it? And making sure that it is working right, that is fit for purpose. You're talking about, training for judges, and we've never got in there, never, it's all about their judicial independence. We have one judge in the family court, for example, has been judicially reviewed more than any judge in the world. He has cost the public purse, I don't know how much money, and he's still floating about. He really is, and it's so very frustrating. We've got another letter in to the Lady Chief Justice about a month ago, and they've just acknowledged it, but they haven't done anything, based again on a number of cases where we think that women are at risk because orders have not been extended or granted. And the orders, protection orders within especially the Belfast court have really decreased dramatically over the last 10 years. So where are those women going? The numbers to our services are increasing, the numbers to the police are increasing. Where are they going for protection? So we have brought it to the Justice Minister, who said it's not up to her because it's judges and it's the court, and we brought it to the Victims Commissioner as well, and nobody really wants to hear, so it's gone again to the Lady Chief Justice. So hopefully between them all they'll give us an audience and be able to speak to some of these women, because I do worry, people not getting orders granted. What's going to happen? Somebody's going to get killed, and that ultimately will be another domestic homicide review. We need to work in partnership. We really do. We talked about at the start the North-South cooperation, and the collaboration we have with partners in the South. We also work very closely, with our federation sisters in England, Scotland, and Wales. We have, a brilliant women's sector here with, the Women's Policy Group. Meeting every month, a fountain of knowledge and expertise. And if you don't have time to do that other wee consultation, you can go, can I just bump and support yours, or can you help me with this, because we are so under pressure. So we really have such a rich sector, which we really welcome and are very privileged to be part of. We need to hold perpetrators to account. We are constantly talking about women, especially in the family court. It is a real challenge for us, and that failure to protect narrative. We need to swing that right round, and we need to talk about these perpetrators. We need to change our children's order in relation to that automatic presumption of contact and look at something else. Because the family court, without a shadow of doubt, is one of the most challenging things. Sorry, I'll hurry up here. Funding and resourcing, that is a huge issue. The Domestic and Sexual Abuse Strategy just dropped something around funding yesterday. The form is to be in by the 9th of December and it has to be spent by the end of March. You know, they haven't a clue about resourcing people properly. So people will put in for, projects here and there, but really, are they changing anything? So we really need to do that data collection and research. Our data collection over here is terrible. If we look at the way it's collected, what is it actually telling us? We're looking at funding. How do we know what we need to fund? And so we really would welcome a whole change to that. We need to listen to the voices of survivors without a shadow of a doubt. So look, we need to all work together and recognise the ways in which domestic abuse and trauma shape a woman's response in all interventions, and ensure that a woman has a voice in all of her interventions and that of her children and young people. So that is me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sonia, and thank you to Women's Aid for all the work that you continue to spearhead. And thank you also for providing putting a face to domestic abuse in Northern Ireland. I think that's really important that we don't lose sight of how this actually impacts on people with real lives, and that's really important. I know that we had said we were going to end at 7:30, folks, but I wonder if Eliana and Sonia are agreeable. We could have a very quick 5 minutes for questions. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Does anybody want to ask a question? I can't see everyone all at once, guys. So if anybody, I don't think anybody does currently. Maybe I'll ask just a really quick question. It is about data. I know of data in Northern Ireland is not great. We've lost a resource of data, presumably, whenever we exited the EU. I wonder if there's anything. My first question, I think, is to Eliana about whether or not the domestic abuse, or sorry, the VOG directive makes any provision for strengthening data collection. And then my follow-up question to Sonia is how we replicate that here.
Yes, it does. It's not as strong as we wanted it to be, but as a matter of fact, today we were having a conversation with IGE, and then the Fundamental Rights Agency, because the new survey on gender-based violence was the initial findings shared on Monday, and then more detailed today. And that is one of the key aspects. So the idea is to continue to follow up in terms of data collection to the extent that it is possible, because the issue is that even though the directive seems to harmonize the approaches, in this case also to data collection, member states can also decide still on their own what is the specific lens that they're going to use to collecting that data. So in reality, we still have the challenge that the data that is being collected and will be collected as a result of this directive, it will not be as comparable. And some member states also took the prerogative, and that is in the articles, that they can decide how to implement it, because a directive is not a matter of implementing each article, but the full scope of it and the intention of the directive. And that poses definitely further challenges when it comes to a continuous invisibilization of how really gender-based violence, violence against women and girls, and domestic violence looks like at the national level. But that's what member states are trying to prevent, in any case, to have detailed data.
Thank you.
I think our data collection is just absolutely awful. Nobody collects it in the same way, and we have to be mindful of the shared language. There just isn't really the shared language. If we look at court service, PPS, for example, I have to do a freedom of information every time I want the most basic information. That should be open and transparent. The Crown Prosecution Service, for example, in England, they have a dashboard. It's all open, transparent. The bulletin from Public Prosecution Service this morning was very good. We don't have the same, that was in relation to sexual offences, but we don't have the same in relation to domestic abuse, for example. Also, the PPS don't collect protected characteristics, and that, there's all of those challenges. So all of these organisations need to come together with a shared language and be able to, better inform us. I shouldn't have to jump through hoops to try and find out how many, non-molestation orders, protection orders there are, how many legal aid waivers there have been. There's no connection to the relationship between the person getting the order and that kind of thing as well. It's really, really failing us, and it's failing victims and survivors.
Thank you for that. Maxine, I see you have a question. If we could just keep it super brief, and then we'll try and get away by 22, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Listen, the only thing I wanted to talk about is, the RSE mini consultation was due in this week, and I suppose one of the big things there is one, I suppose it's really just comment on it. One, that RSE, as we know, there's opt-outs. So where does that leave us? And I suppose if Elia has anything there in relation from Europe that can help us on this, around that it shouldn't be allowed to be opt-out. Parents can't opt out for their children. That it needs to be mandatory. And I suppose the connection to that also is around consent, and consent isn't even in there. And I suppose we believe that consent should be part of that education. So I suppose maybe comments, but certainly anybody else's opinions on it would like to hear. Thank you.
It's a great point, Maxine. Thank you. I wonder if Eliana or Sonya have anything to add on that.
You can.
Sonia, if you can go ahead first, and then I'll comment. Okay. In terms of consent, it is included in terms of one of the articles talks about creating a culture of consent in Europe. However, we don't know what that really means. And there, one of the aspects that I didn't touch, but it was in the presentation, which I have shared, and I'm happy that that's made available to everyone. I have no problem with that, is that we do have a conversation currently in the EU about the directive on sexual abuse of children. And then the Commission has mentioned that maybe there is an opening there to include an article on consent. On the other hand, some institutions and organizations are a bit concerned that this is going to be the case, specifically in the context of such a directive, because if this is wrongly interpreted, then are we saying that children can actually consent to sex? So this whole discussion about the age of consent, when we are including this specifically on a child sex abuse perspective and directive, can be very, very difficult. So that's what I can share. And then the first part that you were mentioning, there was an acronym that you mentioned that I am not aware of, so I didn't get that first part of the question.
Apologies, Eliana. I think it was relationships and sexuality education, so just that education piece in schools.
Thank you.
Sonia, do you have anything to add?
Oh, not really. It's just a disaster, isn't it? It's really quite depressing, the whole subject matter, because as I said, we have been talking about it for so long. We were meant to be before the committee this week, maybe, Karen, correct? And it got cancelled to the end of January. So I think they have a lot of people that want to come forward. But even we had to push them, as did many of the members of the Women's Policy Group, because we weren't invited. We had to say, well, hey ho, we actually have a lot to say here, so you're going to listen to us. So, we can just keep pushing and pushing, but the opt-out, the issue of the Board of Governors, all of these things simply are not good enough. As I said at the start, it's a children's basic human right. We have so many children within our services who don't know what a healthy relationship is. They've grown up in such difficult circumstances. So we deserve that, for each and every one of them. So let's hope, we'll all chip away and make this change. But it is a challenge with the DUP Education Minister.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you again to both of you for being with us tonight, and for spending that extra bit of time with us as well. I know we had said we'd taken up 10 minutes extra, and Sonia's in the office. It's dreadful. But yes, no, thank you so much. Both of those presentations were so interesting, and Yana can make those available then again on our website. I assume, or they'll be emailed. Something will happen, and you'll get to see it. So, and again, if I can just thank everybody as well for being with us this evening, and for spending this extra time with us too. I really, really appreciate it. So go off into the night, folks. Have a lovely evening. Take from this that we have a very committed women's sector in Northern Ireland, and we will keep pushing and pushing for better for everybody, for women and girls, and children at large. Thank you so much. It's great to see you. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.